to the In Conversation with Rue Pigalle. My guest today is Seth Kennedy, who is an antiquarian horologer, I apologize, and a pocket watch case maker. Seth is a QEST scholar, which is, as you know by now, we have met several of them. It's an absolutely incredible achievement and a wonderful organization to be a member of. His studio is located in north of London at Grandey's place, and we'll hear a little bit more about it just now. Seth, thank you so very much for having us today in your studio. It's a real privilege. So my first question, I think, has to be, what is an antiquarian horologist?
Well, you could be many things and be an antiquarian horologist, but involving old items revolving around time. So, I mean, you could make sundials or restore sundials or clocks and still be an antiquarian horologist. My speciality, if you like, within that umbrella is pocket watches, so antique watches. Most of the watches that I deal with are 18th and 19th century, some a bit newer up to sort of Second World War era, but some earlier 17th century. So I kind of cover quite a wide range.
Someone is saying that they can't hear you. I can hear you, so maybe Ava, that might be your system. Maybe put your sound up. So how did you get into that? Because it's a pretty specialized area.
Yeah, I did a degree in mechanical engineering, but my engineering career didn't last very long due to redundancy, and I got introduced to the antique watch world through an old family friend, and sort of it took to it, and it's suited me, and that was sort of 18 years ago now. I had a mentor to begin with, who showed me some things and, you know, was there to answer my questions. He obviously also restored watches, and I sort of learned some case repair techniques from him. But then in more recent years, or 6 or 7 years ago, I sort of moved into making cases complete. So I do that as well as restoring old watches and the mechanisms. So
right. Your mentor was someone who was quite an exceptional person, wasn't he?
Yeah, my mentor was a chap called Ray Bell. He lived out in Malvern, sort of west of England. He was physically disabled, and was able to do incredible things, really. And you know, it really opened my eyes to sort of not having, you know, that things weren't a barrier. You know, those things weren't a barrier to being able to turn out the work that he did. So yeah, sadly he passed away. I guess I don't know now. It's well over 10 years ago.
Right. Because he couldn't hold the tools and the watches and the pieces the way we all do. Is that right?
Had to hold, you know, screwdrivers and things in a different way to the way that you normally would. But yeah, that, you know, it wasn't a barrier.
Right. So you got into that, you know, again, I was just saying a little bit earlier, you make lemonade out of lemon, but in your case, it turned out really well. You discovered that passion for the old watches. When did watch mechanisms or watches started appearing? When did people start using them?
So watches mostly have a root, if you like, in the 16th century, but they were very rare, expensive. They weren't made in any great number, and they weren't very good at keeping time. I mean, they were really a plaything of the rich to show off their wealth. Once you got to the early parts of the 17th century, there were more makers around. It had moved a bit more internationally, so there were makers most of the way around Europe, and they were still exceedingly expensive. I mean, they didn't become cheaper objects until the 19th century, really. And that's all through the changing technologies and the manufacturing methods and processes and the people involved. So they were always kind of a wealthy thing. There were technological improvements, particularly in the later 17th century, that made them much better timekeepers. So all of a sudden, as well as with clocks as well, so all of a sudden these things that had really been not particularly accurate at all became much became more like scientific instruments. They had a use and a value for keeping time.
Right. And it's, I mean, I was fascinated when we were talking a little bit earlier, preparing for this conversation. You told me that in fact, it's the spring that made, or the inclusion of the spring in the mechanism that made watches possible.
Yes, effectively in the middle of the 17th century, the pendulum was applied to a clock mechanism, and that regulated the way that the clock ran. And so clocks instantly became much more accurate. And then about 20 years later, a spring was developed, or sort of designed, that had the same effect within a watch. So it made the balance in a watch that swings to and fro, which is what regulates the timekeeping of the watch, and restricts how quickly the watch runs. That became a much more reliable device once it had a spring applied to it that would restrict its movements, or sort of regulate its movements much better.
Right. Now, from a fashion point of view, I mean, I think that the watches were first worn on a chatelaine. Is that right?
The earliest were worn probably on a cord around the neck, so almost as a very heavy pendant. I mean, they weren't probably weren't very pleasant things to wear in that way, but they were a showpiece, but yes, and then chatelaines, so on the waist, in particular, sort of through the 18th century, certainly that was the way. I mean, the watches existed before pockets, so sort of, while I say I do pocket watches, there might be some watches that I've done that, there weren't pockets as such, or a pocket was a separate pouch that you would have on a belt, something.
Right. And when did they move to the wrist?
So they moved to the wrist. The earliest movements to the wrist were later 19th century, or certainly bracelet watches for women, or targeted at women, existed in the 19th century. Men didn't really start wearing them until it became found to be a useful way of wearing a watch in the military. And the First World War was the big push, basically, to wristwatches.
Right.
The earliest wristwatches that men wore were small pocket watches within a sort of a leather strap that sort of housed the pocket watch basically on your wrist. But that soon developed into sort of purpose-made wristwatches.
Right. So we're going to have a look at some watches that I'm going to share my screen now. We're going to have a look at some watches, and you're going to take us through that, because you sent photos of some really spectacular pieces here. So here is the first example.
Yeah, so there's 3 watches that we're going to look at, and all 3 are in cases which I've made, because I was going to be talking about case making. And I picked 3 from sort of about 100 years apart, each one. So this watch dates from around 1700, made in London. It's what's known as a pair-cased watch, in that the movement is within an inner case known as the box in the old watch language, and then there's an outer case which sort of houses and protects that. Very many watches of this type lost their outer cases because they could, the buttons and catches would work loose, and the case could just sort of drop off as you were walking along. And so this is a watch that didn't have an outer case. A reason for an inner case and an outer case is that these watches are all wound with a key, and so there's a hole in the back of the case, of the inner case, to insert the key to wind the watch up. So you have an outer case in order to cover that hole, basically.
Right. And I see that it has the word London on it. London was the watchmaking center at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. So from the middle of the 17th century, London became a very important place in terms of watch and clock making, and was or if not the lead city really for watchmaking for a couple of 100 years, pretty much. All of the best watches really came from or would have been finished in London sort of over that period. Obviously you had some very good foreign makers as well, sort of Breguet in Paris, and also, the English weren't the only people making watches at the time, but certainly the volume and a lot of the development was done in London.
Right. There is a question here from Beryl who asks, where does the term fob watch come from?
Well, fob, I'm not entirely sure. The fob is often used to describe sort of one of the sort of dangling things you might have from the chain might be known as the fob. So the watch sort of becomes attached to that. I can't really answer, I'm afraid. It's one of those sort of terms that's I would describe a fob watch as being different to a pocket watch in a way. A fob watch I would think of as being a smaller sort of cheaper item.
Right.
But that's my own sort of thinking on it.
Didn't you tell me that pocket watches existed before pockets existed, or did I dream that?
No, that's the case. Yes, pocket watches were around before pockets were applied to clothing or sewn in as part of an item of clothing.
So where does the name come from?
Well, because they then ended up in pockets quite.
Oh, I see.
Or a pocket was a separate pouch, I think. So it was known as a pocket.
I see. Okay. So let's go back to sharing my screen and to going to the second watch. This one.
Well, this is the same watch. So this is with
the same watch, different view.
Yeah, different view. So this is with the front bezel, if you like, opened at the hinge. So the hinge there on the left, or joint as it's properly known in horological terms, has got it's made up of 7 little bits of tube. So it's quite a challenge when you're making to get them all in the right position, so that when you slot them together, like that you end up with a good tight joint. So you can see the inner case sort of sitting within that outer ring. And it's the inner case that has the little pendant and bow at the top attached to it.
Yeah. And we can also see the assay mark on the left. Do you have your own mark?
Yeah, so I have my own mark. So all the cases I make are all assayed at the London Assay Office, which is in Goldsmiths Hall, which is where it's been for hundreds of years. It's something I quite like, that when I finished making the case, I take it to exactly the same spot that someone would have taken a case 300 years ago in order to have it all marked. Different building, but same site.
And what's on your mark? What do you have on your mark?
It's just a SK. I just have an SK.
Right.
The hallmark's made up of several marks. So you have a fineness mark, which is the grade of metal, if you like, and then a city mark. So London, in my case, which is a leopard's head. And you have a year letter, so that changes every year, and they change font style, if you like, as well each time, so you can tell the year that anything silver has been made or gold. And then my maker's mark in SK.
Yeah, we did a lecture series in June with Goldsmith, and we had an explanation of some of the marks and all that. It's absolutely fascinating, and the history and the whole, which is unbelievable. So anyway, so here, what are we looking at?
So this is the inside. This is the movement of that watch,
right.
Sort of hinged out of its inner case. So this inner case is 320 years old, and the movement itself. This was made by a chap called Charles Gretton, who had his shop on Fleet Street.
Right. I mean, it's exquisitely. It's jewelry. This filigree almost. That design is delicious.
The amount of decoration you have on movements of watches has always been exceptional, and the better made the watch is, sort of the more people went to town on some of the decorations. And it's interesting as you go through the various eras, that there would be features on a watch like this from about 1700 that have disappeared by about 1720, and it's a way that you can you know, it's quite nice when you see early features that you know you're not going to find on most watches, but you know, it's something that makes something a bit special.
Yeah. I want to come back to you here for a second, because I want to discuss that discovery element when you get a watch and you open it, and what you find inside in the stories. Just share that a little bit with us. I find it extremely moving, but I think it's important to share that.
It can be fascinating. Watchmakers have often left their marks. Sometimes perhaps an invoice number effectively, or a job number that they've scratched into the case. But you do also find marks and signatures of people involved in the original manufacture of the watch. So dials, enamel dials, are very often signed on the back, on the enamel that you have on the back of the dial. So you'll know the name of the person that made it, or even instructions. I had a dial recently that had, from about 1800, that had a fairly strange layout of the hour and minute numbers. And on the back were basically instructions saying, like, you know, hours 1, 2, 3 and minutes 5, you know, in the order and position of them. So it's, you know, it's amazing when you come across something like that. I think I told you that I had a very complicated musical watch, a watch with a musical music mechanism inside it. And it had a broken mainspring. The spring that actually operated the music, sort of the music box element of it, was broken, and I had to take everything apart in order to get to that spring. And when I took the final part off, which was the barrel that holds this spring that was broken, on the plate underneath it was a signature, a name, and a year, which I think was about 1820 or 1830 or something, and a place, I think Paris, or maybe later than that, maybe about 90. I think the watch was about 1820, and this was obviously the sign of a watchmaker, repairer, who was so proud in a way that he had got this far into this movement that he signed and dated the fact that he had been there. And it could be that I'm the first person that's seen that signature that was scratched there 100 years ago.
Yeah. Do you leave your signature? Do you leave a little sign for the next guy?
It's kind of not. It's the quandary between restoration and preservation, if you like. That these days, you know, people restoring or preserving things, if you like, tend not to put their own stamp in them, which they might have done, you know, in the past. So no, as a rule, I don't. There are occasions when I would mark a new part that I've made in the watch as being that I've made that bit now, so it can never be assumed or considered as being an original component.
Right.
That could I mean, a bit like hallmarking a case. If I made a case and didn't hallmark it, like that one we've just been looking at, someone might look at it and think it was 300 years old, which would affect the value of the watch. And so the hallmark, if you like, is my statement that it's a new thing.
Do you keep track of all the watches? Do you have a registry of all the watches that come through your shop and the history and all that?
Well, I keep a log of the jobs that I do. So it's not that it's paper, so it's not that orderly. I can't really search through it very easily. But yeah, and things that are particularly special, I photograph a lot, so I have a lot of photos and things that are particularly special and sort of get set in a separate folder. So yeah.
Okay, let's carry on our exploration of watches. So new piece here.
So this now moving sort of 100 or so years on. This is a watch made, or the movement made in Paris, and I can very closely date it to about 1793 because of the way that this watch movement has been signed. But this is in a case which also I've made for it, because you wouldn't get a case of that time with a glass back in the way that this one is, or very unusually would you have that. So this is something which I do, where I'll make cases that have period style in terms of the pendant and bow at the top, and the general form and shape of the case and decoration, but incorporating a modern element, if you like, in making the movements sort of visible, so you can watch it going.
Right.
But the signature on this watch is interesting because it's it mentions, and it's got one name, and then it says successor to another name. and that other name was an important watchmaker in Paris at the time, who had probably had very high associations with all sorts of gentry and things. And during the French Revolution, it wasn't really a very good thing to be associated with all those people. And so he signed his business over to one of his workmen. And so for a period of about 18 months, watches were made with that workman's name, Cachard, successor to the Roi. And this is a watch of that from that time period.
Amazing.
So yeah, so it's an interesting, it was worth casing in a way just because it's got that interesting story to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the final one of the three, moving another 100 years up. So this is a movement from about 1910, 1912, and this was my most recent case, which I finished a few weeks ago. It's an American-made movement by a company called Howard. It's known as the Edward Howard. They made a very small number of them, somewhere around 250. And it was at a time when some of the American watch manufacturers were just making the best that they could just to sort of show off their abilities. So right. This is the Edward Howard. And it had lost its original case. And so my client decided to have me make something special to put it in. So it's in, if you click on, I think to the next one, Isabel, it's in a cabriolet case, which means that it can flip round into two different styles.
It's fun.
Yeah. So the movement is housed within a band, which can rotate within the outer case. So you can have it such that it's either displays the dial through the glass bezel, like glass front, or displays the movement, and the other cover, the full dome, is sprung loaded. So when you push the button, that springs up, which is like a hunter cased watch. And you can see there also, there's a photo frame of the client and his wife that I've incorporated into the dome. So it's become sort of, it's an heirloom piece, if you like.
Just before we go to the next photo, the glass, I don't know what you call it. What is the technical term when you talk about the glass that covers the watch?
Well, they're sometimes known as crystals.
Right.
Or that term generally, sort of these days, refers to plastic glasses, whereas everything I use, I have quite a good stock of genuine old glass, and I always try and use glass when I can.
Right. Where are they made, and who makes that? Are they companies that specialize in that? Because
so there were, and there still are. I would imagine that most modern glasses are either made by probably one firm in Switzerland, or they're probably made in China. Many of the old glasses, I mean, I have new glasses that are well over 100 years old, and many of them I think were also French or Swiss made. There were various ways of making them. The early watches, like the first one that we saw, have a very, very high dome because the movement is quite tall in the hands. And those were actually made by glass blowing a sphere and then cutting circles out of the sphere. And that's a method that was used well into the late 19th century, as far as I'm aware.
Right.
Glass, it's a rare craft to find someone who can make watch glasses. It's something I might look into in future, because for the early watches, I mean, I have some, but you never know, and I can grind them down to size if I have one slightly big, but it would be quite nice to be able to make my own scratch. Not with blowing, there are other ways of doing it too.
Right. Okay, let's we're gonna go back to the clocks and the watches, sorry. So here we have something different.
Yeah, so this is the subject of my QEST scholarship, which is the art of engine turning. Engine turning is a branch of ornamental turning, which is a craft which goes back 400 years or more. It's uses a lathe, mechanical equipment. We'll have a closer look at mine in a bit, and it's a way of applying decoration, applying engraved decoration basically to a metal surface. That's a definition of engine turning. There's an almost infinite number of things you can sort of combinations to make different patterns. The examples I've seen are both flat. I mean, this looks three-dimensional, like there's a wave there, but it is just a flat disc. The reason I'm interested in it is because watch cases were engine turned very commonly from the late 18th century right the way up to the early 20th century. And so it's going to be a way of finishing you know, a quality pocket watch case to have the dome engine turned. Mm-hmm. I'm still learning. I've got further to go, but you know, these are examples of some sort of my practice discs that I've been making.
Right. Oh, so we're coming to the end of one last look at that gorgeous, gorgeous watch and your website here, which I really want to share with everybody. So now we're going to see how it's done. You're going to take us. You're going to take us through your studio. We're going to do a little a swap of camera. And you're going to give us a tour of your studio and show us a little bit how the equipment works.
Okay, let's try. Right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. And you can see me?
We're seeing you now, yes.
Right. So this is my main sort of bench, if you like, where I sort of work on bits and pieces, take things apart, put them together. So I've got a few little pieces on there. You can see this is actually that second watch that we that you could see earlier, which is sitting there ticking away. And some other engine turn discs. This is how a movement will come to me, if you like, in order to make a case for it. So this is a high quality London finished watch movement from about 1890. It's actually broken, it won't run, but it's you know, it's of a standard that could be worth making a case for, basically, because it's a costly exercise, and so it needs to be something worthwhile. Here's just a couple of other bits to show how a case sort of is built up. That it starts as bits of wire. This is all silver and sheet, and the wire is formed round into rings, soldered together and formed into rings, and it's those rings that sort of make up the center band and the edges of the bezels of the case. So that's just sort of a little you know, examples really of some of the case making parts. So Isabel suggested I gave you a little tour around.
Yes.
Sorry?
Do you use the tools that you use? Are they modern tools? Are they tools, you know, that have been in use for 300 years? And tell us a bit about that.
Well, some of the tools are old. Some of them may be relatively new. There are things like this pair of pliers, which are used particularly when making the bow at the top of the watch that the chain would attach to. And this is a pair of pliers that are probably at least 100 years old, but still work perfectly. And it's just really nice, and they're so tactile when you have something that you know has been through so many sort of hands of craftsmen. So I've got some tools certainly dating back to the 19th century, which I still use. So just to the right of that set of the bench is where I do my soldering, which if you're familiar with jewellery, I mean, it's the same process as that. And then sitting on the stool, if I swing to my left, I've got my the main lathe that I use for case making. So you know, right next to the bench. So right. This lathe is a Paltra Lathe made in Manchester in the northwest of England in the 1950s. They were a very high quality lathe to do precision work. and you know, it's quite nice. It's still got its label on from the first company that bought it new, a place called Electro Hydraulics. So you know, I quite like the patina, if you like, of using it in its original state.
Sure. We have a question from Kathy, who's asking, how long on average does it take you to restore a watch and make it work again?
It's difficult. It's so variable. It depends on the watch. It depends how complicated it is and what's broken. I mean, you know, I may be able to get through servicing a watch or whatever within a day quite comfortably. But you know, when you get on to much more complicated things, it could be a matter of a couple of weeks of just trying to restore a movement to get it going. It just depends on on what might be broken.
Right.
Case making, the gold case that I've just finished was actually in process for over a year, but has had lots of, you know, it's not been a normal year. So, you know, there are some projects that do end up taking a long time. If I carry on and turn this way around, this is a machine which is new to me, which is a Swiss milling machine specifically for horological work, which I've sort of restored the machine. I've not yet got it cutting anything, but I'm in the process of making up some tooling to do some particular work on it. So that was something I wasn't expecting to buy, but it came along and was daft not to get at the time.
A new toy.
Sorry?
A new toy.
Yes, a new toy, absolutely. Next to it is this lathe, which is my big lathe. This actually I bought new. It's a relatively cheap modern machine, but it's pretty good at, you know, roughing things, and I use it to make a lot of the tooling that I then use in the case making. I've actually been cutting a piece on it today. This big steel disc here, which is a part which will then go on this machine into here, which will then allow me to deal with rosettes for the rose engine, which we'll come to in a little while.
Right.
So in the middle of the room, I have this homemade bench where I do you know, sort of rough work. These are my case making punches and dies, all of which I've made on the big lathe. So these are used to make, when I solder those silver rings, these I use to make them round and flat, basically, and also then to taper to make something slightly conical. If making a bezel that needs an angle, it's all done here, and it's quite nice as a watchmaker to occasionally use a pretty big mallet and thump these things quite hard.
Which is surprising because it all looks so small and delicate.
Well, the case maker, yes, it's quite surprising what you can, yeah, how hard you can hit stuff sometimes. This is just a modern bench grind, but it's where I do polishing. The mops and things go on the end of this spindle here. When polishing a case, I go through, you know, many stages to get to the final polish. Just on my right here, I've got a sort of a display cabinet with a few old bits and pieces, and there's a whole selection of sort of old movements that you collect. You know, these things just are required over time, and some other bits of tools and things that are currently not sort of not needed. This is another part of the case making process, whereby in here are dies which I can put in here, and these are made. I make these out of nylon, and these are made used when I'm making the domes for a case. So if I take that, so that's a steel dome which I've turned on the big lathe. It has a hole in it, so it locates there centrally over the die, and then it'll drop. But you can see when I pull a big lever over the dome, I'll put my sheet of metal on the die, and then the dome will form it into a cup shape.
Right.
It's not a one hit process. It can actually take a good sort of 20 minutes, half an hour because the metal will try and crinkle and bend. So to get a smooth dome, it can, you know, it's a little bit at a time. It's not quite the mallet method of the rings. And here is a roller, so for rolling wire down to the sort of particular size I might need, or forming things.
So a lot of your tools are actually manual tools, and there's not a lot of, I mean, some of the machines are, I think, powered by electricity, but I see a lot of hand movement around there.
A lot of it's how, I mean, the methods that I'm using, you know, these punches and dies are a method that goes back centuries, I think, the way that cases were made. I sort of picked up this method from a film that was produced around 20 years ago by a chap who was a 4th generation watch case maker. And there are sort of other workshops, if you like, of tools which still exist that were of watch case makers. And they use these punches and dies to form, you know, in slightly different ways that I do it, but essentially doing the same thing.
Right.
Just here, I've got something I've actually been working on today, which is a first go at something. This is an outer case from a watch from about 1770, I think. And originally, I don't know whether you'll be able to see it very clearly, but originally it was leather covered, and it had a sort of a star pattern of pins that held the leather onto the case. And the leather is long gone, and this is now just the plain brass that these leather covered cases were. So I'm actually, I got the leather from my neighbour in the next workshop, who was a leather worker, and I've made a die out of plastic rod, and I'm just trying to wet form the leather into a dome, such that when I trim it, it will sit nicely on the case.
Right. It's fantastic. It's wonderful.
So that's something. It's the first go I'm having at doing this, but it's a skill that, you know, is useful, and it's part of a watch case maker's. Well, you know, a watch case maker of old wouldn't have done this themselves. They would have had someone who would have done this leather work. But for me, you know, I need to be able to do everything, like we were talking about glass making, perhaps.
Yeah.
So if I come back around here now to this side of the bench that the Paltra on, so this has got a watchmaker's lathe, which I use occasionally just for doing some fine work, and also this shaft drive setup, which is a bit of a folly, if you like, but it's something that I've always longed to have, a shaft drive, the way that they used to in the old factories that you see, with all the very dangerous pulleys spinning around and everything. And I don't use this for very much. It's more for effect and for looks, but I'm just quite proud of having it sitting here on the bench. But I can polish a case with it. It's actually powered by a treadle underneath.
Right.
There's a foot treadle there, belt drive. So if we do have a power cut, I could carry on doing things.
It's always good to have a backup plan.
Yes, yeah. And then the other side of it is my Rose engine, which we were talking about for doing the engine turning. So this also is a hand-powered device. You can see the pulleys on this end. And the way that this works.
You're going to give us a demonstration?
Yeah, so we can have a go at a demonstration. We'll see what we can see. But if I try and sort of show how it's what it does. The piece of work is mounted on the very front. I have a brass disc just mounted in there at the moment, and there are various different ways of mounting things, but I'm using these sort of modern plastic jaws to help with. And on a normal lathe, like the other machines I have, you would want the rotation of the work to be really fixed solidly, so it just goes round in a circle and it's really solid. A Rose engine is different in that the spindle is actually pivoted down at the bottom here, and this arm and all of this can swing to and fro, and it's sprung. There's a spring underneath which is pushing it in this direction towards us, and these pieces here are called the rosettes, and they have different, you can see the sort of different numbers of bumps and shapes on them. And right here is the piece called the rubber, and the the whole spindle is resting against the rubber here, such that as I rotate the handle, the rubber rides over the bumps of the rosette. And the effect that has is that the work moves to and fro very slightly. You might be able to see it happening.
Yeah. That's how you create the pattern on your disc.
Yeah, so that's how you create the pattern. So I've got the I use a pencil here. The cutting tool is fixed in a slide which can move to and fro, and is right at the tip here. And the cutting tool and the shape of it is very important to the finished work. So I'm sorry for the shaking. I'm just going to try and put the tripod down such that you might be able to see it.
Yep, it's perfect.
You'll see it cutting. So I'm now going to push manually on the back of the tool up against the metal. I've sort of set this up in advance, and then just turning the handle, and you might be able to see the curl of metal coming off that, and that's tracing a line.
Seth, if you move your phone away from the tool by like half an inch, it will help with the focus. The phone is struggling. So yeah, here we go. That's great. Thank you.
Is that better? It might be.
Yeah. So now we can see properly. Thank you.
So now you can probably see it going to and fro and cutting. So I've gone all the way around now, and it's cut a wavy line. You might be able to see it clearer up the top where the light's catching it. So once you've cut a line, you can then move the tool across, which I'm doing. I've done now slightly. And you can also rotate the work relative to the bumps on the rosette. And that's how you create different patterns. So now I'm going around just cutting another groove just inside the last one. But in the same orientation, you can see the metal curling off there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So now there's two lines very close together. You can sort of see the shininess that you get. And so that's a brief demonstration, if you like, of the engine turning process.
Oh, it's fantastic. We could see it so well. It was very clear. Thank you so much. Are we going back to your other camera?
If you're happy with that, yeah, we could go back to the other device. So I'll leave that one. Okay.
Do you want to? You might have to switch off your phone. Get out of the call, so we don't have the echo. And unmute yourself.
There we go. Done.
There we go.
Right.
But you need to switch off your phone. We have an echo. Your phone is still on.
I've left the meeting. Right. I've turned it right off.
Great. Thank you so much. Kathy is asking if you have an apprentice.
I've been mentoring someone in the last couple of years, more on the watchmaking really than the case making. It's something that I do want to do. I moved into this workshop last winter, and I decided then I needed, some time to settle in and get myself sorted here. Obviously, we've had a rather upset year. So, I still need a bit of stability before I can bring someone else in, I think. But it's certainly my plan to try and pass on these skills that I'm learning from others and also developing myself. And there are so few people that make watch cases in the way that I do in this traditional method that it really is something that needs preserving. So yeah, it's on the cards.
And where you are now, where you said you just moved in this new studio, it's a very special place, Grandey's place.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. There's about 24 or so studios altogether here, Mine is actually one of the smaller rooms. There are some larger units, and it's this. It's been built and put together by a chap called Clive Beecham, who's passionate about sort of supporting craft work. A number of us are QEST scholars. It's all sort of high-end, you know, sort of craft working. I have a violin restorer just opposite me. The chap next door makes sort of you know, very smart leather bags. There's dressmakers, there's upholsterers, there's a stained glass sculptor, you know, ceramics, a whole variety of things. It's a really great little community that's sort of being developed here, in a lovely position out in the countryside in Hertfordshire.
It's on my list of places to visit when I come next.
Yeah,
Sally Ann is asking, you working for private individuals or museums or both?
When I started, almost all of my work was for a couple of watch dealers. I've since diversified a bit, if you like. I do more private sort of collectors work. I do also do the odd watch for someone, you know, as a single inheritance watch, you know, that they want to get working. So it's a split, really. I've not done any work specifically, excuse me, for museums. I know some of the museum horological people I'm friends with, but museums often just want their objects to stay as they are, not necessarily be restored. And so, you know, there's a slight, but, you know, it's on the cards to, you know, it may happen.
Would you, I mean, if I wanted to buy one of these watches, I mean, would you create your own collection in the sense that would you buy old watches, repair them, and then sell them as such? So have a line of business a little bit like a dealer or a retail shop? I mean, it's a different kind of investment, but
yeah, that's not quite, I suppose, where I am. I do have a long-term goal to make my own watch is from scratch, so making every single component. But that would be on a very low volume, basically on a commission basis as well. I've sourced watches for people, you know, people that I know anyway. There are, you know, sometimes opportunities like that, but I'm not really a dealer. I'm not that way inclined.
Right.
But it might be that if I have an apprentice, that might be a way that we move into while they're also learning. So I don't know. At the moment, my business plan is slightly variable, but we shall see. I'm quite happy the way that I am, but moving here has given me different opportunities, and so I'm kind of settling in and searching out sort of my direction to some extent, while continuing obviously doing what I do.
Last question. Yeah, of course. So thank you so much. I mean, it was really terrific to have such a great view of the watches and your work, your beautiful equipment, even for someone who couldn't use them. I think that they are just magnificent. So thank you again for welcoming us. Thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoyed it.
It was lovely. It was great.
I will be posting the video on the website and send you the link. This is the second of our third in our time series. The next one is next week, the last one of the year, the last one of this series next week. We're going to meet David Snow Wilson, who, like Seth, is a QEST scholar. I hope it's going to work. We're going deep into the rural Somerset. And the Wi-Fi connection there can be a little tricky, but David is a bell caster. He has a foundry, he makes bells, and he recently made a bell for Prince Charles, and it's a beautiful bell. It's a modern bell, it's beautiful. So I hope you're going to join me. It's posted on the website. If you want to sign up already and register, you can do that. Have a great day, Seth. Thank you again. And I'll see you all next week.